Well, that's what we've been doing as in terms of city staff and such, and when these projects come forward, even if they are proposing private streets, is trying to ensure that they can come as close as possible to current city standards. So that, again, we presented that at Planning Commission, make sure that it's meeting those standards. So if they were to be turned over to the city, or again, the emergency vehicle access, school bus access and such is still being met. So
what's the advantage for a developer to have a private street other than that?
That'd be about.
Well, probably if you didn't have, if you didn't want to have a large enough cul-de-sac or just a dead-end street, you can, with a private street, you can do that. You don't have to have a turnaround. Really, I don't really see any benefits for it other than that.
So the developments that we've seen, I'm thinking, was an Eagles Landing, that was a private street, or was that public? I'm thinking a lot of times it's because they're not meeting the setback requirements and they don't have enough room for the project and the design to meet the city standards for street width. That's probably what I've seen. What I'm hearing are two things that we'd like staff to work on for our next meeting. First of all, the language regarding the meetings. We don't want to have the word mandatory in there, but how the other communities, the phrasing and the wording that they have as far as strongly encouraging meeting with the adjacent residents or homeowners associations, in what part of their text is it in? Is it in when they meet with staff? What part of their, I don't know if they call it UDC code books, so what part of their codes do they have that in, and how is it worded, so we can kind of choose which wording we think would be more appropriate in Blue Springs. The second thing is, again, the language that is in the other communities that discourage private streets when they say only under special conditions, and what part of their codes does that come in? Does that come under site plan design review? Does that come in under their PUDs? At what point do they incorporate that language that they discourage private streets? And you might, if you get a chance, I know Paige's got a lot to do, but if you get a chance, what exceptions, we thought of the gated the community, but any other exceptions that they can tell you where it's allowed under special conditions?
Well, just another example, I know you were saying this is embedded in the code, so it's not just multifamily. What if on a large upscale residential community, you have, for example, say if Indian Hills had a gated community on that, how would that correspond with it? Or like Baroque Estates, which is a gated community. If we have have larger homes that had a gated community for the entire development, how will that work as far as on the private streets? Is there only so many lots within that subdivision to, I don't know. Or maybe have, I don't know. That's what I'm just kind of kicking out there.
And we're looking at the multifamily issue, but if we think that the meeting with residents and the discouraging private streets is a good, we could include in our recommendation that we think this should be a policy the city adopts in the codes for both types of development.
Well, I'm just saying I would like to have the option as a residential developer, have the option if I'm going to do larger homes that possibly have a gated community for a development. That's I mean, I don't want I understand with the school district, I understand with the fire department, I'm 100% behind all that. There's a way to work around it, but to at least allow us the option to be able to do something like that.
Well, and I think if we have the exceptions, that we're going to have to look what other communities have, but just say, with special conditions, I mean, the special condition could be a gated community. Right. Something we haven't addressed is the fact that the people who buy in a gated community, it's definitely more expensive because they have to pay for snow removal themselves as opposed to the city going in and doing it for them. So, I mean, that's something certainly I'm sure developers take under consideration.
And quite frankly, you're not going to have a huge residential development that's all under a gate, a gated community. Just too much wear and tear on the gate, and it's a maintenance nightmare. But to allow us to have the option to be able to do that would be nice.
Yeah, and right now they could do it.
Right now they could.
Right now
I don't think there really has been in a long time, but the option would be there.
Okay.
Paige has it located here in terms of private streets. It's in their subdivision. part of the code?
I have it copied here, at least with respect to Lee's Summit. I don't.
You know what, it's okay, we can have it for our next meeting, exactly where it's at and what the language is.
It speaks very broadly,
It is very broad.
except we're justified by special conditions. But yeah,
That's-
we'll look into more, I think maybe
And they're
give a
doing-
call again and see if they have some examples of maybe where they've allowed that and what the rationale was. for
Well, I
allowing
think
it.
that's something we'd like to see, is
Sure.
not just the gated community, which is a great example, but
Right.
I'm sure there's other situations
Certainly.
where it would be necessary that we haven't thought of. But, you know, and it's a discretionary call on the
Mhm.
planning commission, the city's councils, whether, you know, they approve it or don't approve it. We're just having the recommendation in there that it's discouraged unless there's special conditions.
Right.
And ironically, both the Summit and Olathe have, it's nearly identical. And both planners gave me absolutely identical examples with respect to the ADA requirements.
Oh, really?
Yeah, interesting.
So I'm thinking that both cities probably have had to put this, my guess is, within their code, specifically to address probably ADA, because both of them gave me the
Okay.
example of ADA. So that there's been issues in the past with respect to private streets being necessary under that particular provision.
Okay.
So, but I think definitely.
Yeah, so we can get more
Yeah.
concrete examples.
Well, just because if it's something we want to include in our recommendations, we can just say, we like the way this one is phrased better than this one, this will work better in Blue Springs, and then we could take a vote and kind of vote on which one we think we want to recommend. I know Mr. Allen wants to go over this. Basically, what we're going to do today is we're going to just look at our current ordinances in Blue Springs, and do we have extra copies of this for Mr. Anderson and Mr. Phillips to look at? Or is that it?
The table
Yeah.
is included, the next page, after the,
Yeah, I made a bunch of those.
oh, those, okay. Oh, I see, I'm sorry. We might have,
Okay, different ones out. I hate to have them sitting here not knowing what to talk about. We don't have an overview.
how many would you like?
We just need two.
2 or 3 or 4?
She came with a bigger pack that she
Just
was
need
ready to
one.
roll. So I think basically what we're gonna do is we're just gonna kind of go through our current, this is currently our zoning
Yes.
what our code says, what Lee Summit says, and what Olathe says.
Yep.
And what we're gonna do is kind of look at this, because what we can do for our own codes, we don't have to take Lee Summit's codes, we don't have to take Olathe's. What we can do is incorporate the elements that we like and to kind of borrow from both cities what parts of it we think will work in Blue Springs. And that was kind of the objective today. And have some discussion while we go along, which one you think would work better here, which ones you don't. And hopefully, if we can get this done, this will be a big help to us. If we can go with the zoning, then when we get into the design standards, it's going to make that portion a lot easier if we have in place the kind of zoning we're going to recommend, because then the rest of it kind of falls in line with what the zoning is. So we kind of need to get this done first. So you want to take us through it?
Sure, that's a good point, good segue, because I think that's what we've been finding through looking at a lot of these codes is that the zoning then clearly ties into the design guidelines. They reference back to those, I mean, where you talking about streets and things like that, it just ties in closely to exactly, it starts with the base zoning, so. This is a wonderful table that Shannon and Paige put together. It's painstakingly put together, excuse me. But we kind of narrowed it down again to Lee Summit and Olathe as being kind of the two most comprehensive examples.
And I
And
think,
most-
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I
No,
think
it's
what
fine.
we're going to do is after we discuss each one, while we're in that, we'll make a decision on which one we think fits Blue Springs better, Lee Summit or Olathe. As we go page by page, so that we don't have to go back and forth while we're doing the two-family, when we move onto the mixed-use residential, when we get into the apartment section of it. Each page, we're gonna make a decision on which one we are going to recommend that would suit Blue Springs better, okay? Just to add, I think that'll reduce the confusion if instead of flipping back and
Are
forth.
we gonna be changing naming from TF to R2 or RP2?
Yes.
That I suppose that.
They'll correspond with all the other cities, surrounding
Right.
cities.
Sure.
Well, and you know,
That's
Mr.
what
Allen, you want to tell the committee, when you went to the American Planning Association,
Yes.
you had kind of an epiphany, so,
A bit of sorts, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this at the planning commission meeting on Monday night, but we talked about some of the sessions that staff and the two planning commissioners attended, and one of the planning commissioners kind of went through more of the planning commissioner track, another went through a lot of the signage track, kind of looking at maybe where Blue Springs is headed with revising some codes and such. One session I attended was called "How Sick Is Your Zoning Ordinance?" And it was getting a little bit kind of clever, just playing on words and things about symptoms and ailments and things like that, and try to make it a little bit more interesting since we're talking about codes. But it was good that I was writing down, sadly, writing down a number of symptoms that were similar to what our code has. I mean, just things like are most of your developments being approved as PUDs? Yes. Are just going down the list? Are code amendments, all kind of getting lumped into one place? Are this, that, and the other thing. I don't have all the list in front of me here, but there are a lot of symptoms that made it pretty clear that although our current UDC isn't necessarily on its deathbed, it's clearly not 100% healthy either. So
it's time to revisit our code.
yes, and certainly going through this exercise of looking through a lot of these other communities' codes, as however old they are, they're still somewhat more new and I want to say progressive, but they're a little more standardized than what we have, even though ours is 10 to 12 years old, roughly, which isn't overly outdated, but compared to the other codes we've been looking at, it's still behind the times.
Well, the nice thing is if we adopt the terminology that is used in that community for the developers who build in different communities, it'll be more familiar to them, and it'll have our community kind of in line with other communities. So to
Yes.
answer your question, probably we need to change what we call it, because just for the developers, if they're used to dealing with RP2, let's say, then they'll see RP2 and they'll be familiar with what RP2 is in Lee Summit, or RP2 in Olathe. So.
And clearly staff would be happy to look at other possible labeling as well, if we want to make it more seamless with our current single-family zoning, perhaps. But yeah, usually like a two-letter combination with a number is pretty standardized. So using the RP2 or RP3 or RP4 is not unusual. First one we started out with there on page 1 is the two-family. And you may see NA, and that's simply that it's perhaps not referenced either in, again, Blue Springs, Lee Summit, or Olathe, in these different kind of specific zoning areas. Units per acre, lot size, dwelling size, building coverage, stories or height, units per floor, setbacks, open space requirements, parking, and street width. And those are kind of the top items that are generally included in zoning categories in most zoning codes. So we hit those and try to do a comparison amongst 3 of them. For example, for two-family, it is a little bit unusual to have number of units per acre, and Lee Summit does have one, and it's 7.5 units per acre. Again, that's something that maybe doesn't correlate as closely as perhaps lot size does, which is the square footage per duplex or per unit. I think that's a little more commonplace, I think, to have that kind of restriction across the board rather than for perhaps units per acre. But if you're doing a comparison of all residential development, single family, like estate homes, all the way to the highest intense, high density residential, they all somehow refer back to number of units per acre. So it wouldn't be inappropriate to set a standard. It's just that of the 3 we've looked at, only Lee Summit has done that. But again, we have 8,000 square foot per duplex. That's 4,000 square feet per unit, essentially. And it tracks pretty closely with Lee Summit and Olathe, although both are slightly larger. So it does show maybe a little bit of the age of the zoning code, that we have 8,000, whereas Lee Summit is 9,000, Olathe is 9,500. And again, it may be reduced down to 8,000 square feet. Shannon or Paige recall what the opportunities were to do that. But again, just as a standard number, 9,000 or 9,500 per 2-unit dwelling is pretty commonplace. So 8,000 is, again, lower than that. While you're looking that up,